It wasn't the breaking news banner. It wasn't the flashing alert crawling across a television screen. According to this account, what shattered him happened 3 minutes earlier, in silence, on a normal Tuesday morning in Malibu. A phone rang inside Dick Van Dyke's home, and at nearly 100 years old, a man who built an entire legacy on joy, timing, and laughter felt something in his chest that wasn't age. It was betrayal. Because as this story is told, he had lived long enough to watch eras end. He had watched the golden age fade. He had buried friends. He had mourned the quiet vanishings of the people who once made Hollywood feel like family. But this was different. This wasn't time taking its toll. This wasn't nature doing what nature always does. This was a violation. And the voice on the other end of the line wasn't a manager. It wasn't a publicist. It wasn't a lawyer reading a polished statement designed to protect reputations. The voice, as described here, was trembling. Tom Cruise. And what he allegedly told Dick Van Dyke would send shockwaves through the tightest circles of Hollywood. Not because it was scandalous in the tabloid sense, but because it cracked open something far darker that people, for years, had supposedly been whispering about behind closed doors. You have to understand what the public sees. To the world, Rob Reiner is the lovable filmmaker, the director behind beloved classics, the guy everyone thinks of as warm, sharp, familiar, like a friend you've had your whole life. But to Dick Van Dyke, Rob wasn't Rob Reiner, Hollywood legend. He was simply Carl's boy. In Dick's memory, Rob was the kid who used to run around sets, absorbing everything like oxygen. A kid learning rhythm and comedy the way other kids learn to ride a bike. A kid watching adults create something magical and believing innocently that families, real families, worked like sitcom families. And that's why, in this telling, Dick's silence was deafening. Because Dick wasn't just watching the industry react, he was mourning something personal. To him, Rob wasn't just a director in headlines. Rob was a living bridge to the days when Dick and Carl Reiner were shaping modern television, together, frame by frame, joke by joke, laughter by laughter. So when Dick Van Dyke finally chose to speak, it wasn't going to sound like gossip. It was going to land like a judge's gavel. And the shock in this account wasn't only what happened, it was the realization that the tragedy being discussed wasn't some sudden snap. It was, allegedly, the final brutal chapter of a long escalating nightmare. When Dick sat down, no sparkle, no dance, no trademark grin, people reportedly leaned in the way they do when they sense a truth is about to be said that can't be unsaid. He didn't read a prepared statement. He didn't hide behind legal language. He spoke like a man who had been watching a slow-motion train wreck for years, helpless to stop it, and now forced to look straight into the wreckage. And then came the line that, in this retelling, didn't sound like Hollywood drama at all. It sounded like grief, mixed with something even rarer from a man like Dick Van Dyke. Anger. "I held him when he was a baby," he supposedly said, voice cracking not from age, but from the pressure of holding back rage. And in that moment, the story stops being about a famous director and turns into something far more haunting: a father's love, a family name, a legacy, and the quiet, terrifying possibility that the very thing Rob Reiner was known for, his heart, his empathy, his loyalty, may have been the weakness that trapped him. Because as Dick tells it, Carl Reiner raised Rob to be gentle, thoughtful, a man with no mean bone in his body, and that, Dick suggests, was the fatal flaw. He loved too much, he forgave too much, he protected too hard, and then Dick revealed the detail that changes the temperature of the entire room. According to this story, what Tom Cruise had been hinting at privately was true. There had been alleged turmoil behind the gates of that Brentwood home, escalating for months, growing louder, uglier, more dangerous, and Rob, allegedly, had been hiding it, not from strangers, from friends, from people who would have helped, because he was trying to protect the very person this story centers as the source of the destruction, his son, Nick, a man who demanded the truth on a screen in his films, but, as this account claims, was living a lie inside his own walls. And then, just when the listener thinks this is only grief, Dick brings up something that makes the whole thing feel like a warning that came too late. A lunch. Just 3 weeks before the incident this story describes. Rob looked hollowed out. The spark was gone. He wasn't talking about politics or projects, things that always lit him up. He was talking about legacies. He was talking about whether a father is responsible for the sins of a son. And according to Dick, he reached across the table and grabbed Rob's hand, the same hand that helped shape cinema history. And he felt it trembling. Dick told him to let go, to cut the cord, to save himself. And Rob asked a question that, in this story, hangs in the air like a ghost. How do you stop loving your own blood? That question is where everything breaks. Because if that's the question, then the answer is never clean, never heroic, never cinematic. And in the next part, we go deeper into what Tom Cruise allegedly saw at that house, what warning signs were reportedly flashing, and why, according to Dick Van Dyke, the old Hollywood code of silence may have helped the darkness grow. The detail that makes this story feel even heavier is that Tom Cruise wasn't some distant celebrity hearing rumors from across town. In this account, Cruise was a man built on loyalty, the kind of loyalty that keeps secrets, protects friends, and never breaks ranks in public. He's known for intensity, yes, but also for discipline, for control. And yet, according to Dick Van Dyke, even Tom Cruise reached a breaking point, because what Cruise allegedly witnessed wasn't a family argument. It wasn't a bad mood. It wasn't a single ugly moment that could be explained away the next day. It was a pattern, a feeling, a chilling atmosphere that followed Nick like a shadow. The story says Cruise had been on set with Nick, and something about Nick's presence felt wrong. Not just unpredictable, but dangerous, like chaos with a pulse, like the air in the room was vibrating with menace, and everyone was pretending not to notice, because that's what Hollywood teaches you to do. Smile, keep rolling. Don't make it awkward. Don't say the quiet part out loud. But Cruise couldn't shake it. He allegedly watched the way people adjusted themselves around Nick, the way their voices softened, the way jokes died mid-sentence, the way grown adults, professionals, began acting like cautious kids trying not to wake a sleeping animal. And what shook him most, according to this telling, wasn't Nick alone. It was Rob. Because Rob Reiner, the man who commanded sets, who shaped performances, who controlled entire worlds from behind the camera, was somehow shrinking inside his own life. That's what makes Cruise's reaction so powerful here. After that day, Cruise didn't go to the press. He didn't make a scene. He didn't leak concerns. He did what loyal men do. He called the oldest truth teller he knew, Dick Van Dyke. And in that phone call, as this story is told, Cruz asked a question that sounds simple but carries the weight of a bomb. Should we intervene? Not should we gossip? Not should we distance ourselves? Intervene. Meaning, step into the private war happening behind those gates before something irreversible happened. But that's where the story reveals the trap. Because Van Dyke says the old Hollywood code still ruled them. Rob's privacy, Rob's dignity, the unspoken rule that you don't cross certain lines even when you feel danger rising. So everyone has stayed back. Everyone kept respectful distance. Everyone told themselves the same soothing lie. He's handling it. He's Rob Reiner. He's strong. He'll figure it out. And the most brutal part is what Dick admits next. He says guilt, a heavy, sinking guilt that doesn't fade with time. It grows. Because once the truth explodes, you start replaying every moment you ignored, every warning sign you minimized, every time you chose politeness over protection. Van Dyke describes it like this. Rob Reiner lived in a mansion, but he was living in a war zone, and the people who loved him, the people who could have stepped closer, stayed behind the boundary made of reputation or silence and fear of making things worse. We failed him, Dick says in this account. I failed him. And when a 99-year-old legend says something like that, it doesn't sound like a headline, it sounds like a confession, because it suggests that what happened next wasn't just sudden tragedy. It was the ending of a story that had been screaming for intervention long before the world ever heard a whisper. And in the next part, the narrative turns even darker, because the shocking element, according to Dick, wasn't only the violence, it was the slow financial and emotional bleeding that came before it. The money, the cover-ups, the legal fees, the endless attempts to keep Nick afloat, and how it all became a black hole, swallowing Rob's life. In this narrative, the most horrifying part isn't only the moment everything ended, it's what came before it. Because what Dick Van Dyke describes isn't a sudden tragedy that appeared out of nowhere. He describes a slow, invisible collapse, a quiet kind of destruction that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. But inside the home, it allegedly ate away at everything. He says the shocking element wasn't just the murder itself, it was the bleeding, the slow financial and emotional bleeding that turned Rob Reiner's life into something that felt less like a home and more like a hostage situation that never officially got called what it was. According to this account, money didn't leave Rob's life in normal ways, not for vacations, not for comfort, not for joy. It left in panic payments, money to cover up previous incidents, money for legal fees, money for new apartments over and over again, like throwing stacks of cash into a fire, hoping the flames would finally run out of oxygen. But the fire kept breathing. And Dick calls it what he believes it was, a black hole, a force that pulls and pulls and pulls, until even a giant like Rob Reiner starts to look small. Then Dick shifts the tone again, and it gets darker because he points directly at the story people often tell when a family is destroyed from within, the sympathetic story, the one defense attorneys use, the one that paints the abuser as a victim of pain, addiction, mental illness, bad luck, anything except a choice. But Van Dyke, in this narrative, refuses to soften it. He doesn't mince words. He calls the dynamic predatory. He describes a relationship where Nick allegedly learned something terrifyingly effective, that Rob's love could be exploited, that guilt could be weaponized, that a father's fear could be turned into leverage. Because if you're a decent man, you don't want your son to die. You don't want your son to spiral. You don't want your son to become the headline you never recover from. And Dick says something that lands like a punch because it sounds so heartbreakingly human. Rob wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of his son dying. Think about that. A man nearing the end of his life, successful beyond what most people can imagine, respected by an entire industry, still living with a terror so constant it outweighed death itself. And that terror, as Dick tells it, kept Rob trapped in a loop. Protect, pay, cover, forgive, try again. Protect, pay, cover, forgive, try again. Until the try again became the very thing that let the darkness stay close. And in the middle of that chaos, the narrative introduces the person trying to hold the whole structure together, Michelle. Dick describes her as the anchor, the one trying to keep the ship from sinking while the storm kept growing. And he remembers a call from her on his last birthday. Not a casual call, not a cheerful happy birthday. A call that sounded like someone clinging to the edge of a cliff, still hoping there was a way back. And then comes the detail that makes the ending feel even more cruel. According to Dick, Rob and Michelle had been planning to leave. A full reset, not a new apartment, not another quiet payout, not another maybe this time will be different, a real escape. They were supposed to leave in January. They were packing. They were preparing to step away from the toxicity of Los Angeles, away from the endless cycle, away from the gravitational pull that kept dragging Rob back into the same nightmare. And then Dick says 4 words that feel like a door slamming shut. They never made it. They were packing, and the clock ran out. And in this telling, that's where the motive becomes colder, because it suggests something far more chilling than a moment of a drug-fueled rage. It suggests premeditation born of entitlement, a sense that Rob and Michelle were finally choosing themselves, choosing survival, choosing distance, and that decision was seen not as a boundary, but as a betrayal. And Dick leaves the listener with that terrible implication that the final act wasn't just violence, it was punishment, a last brutal attempt to keep control. Because once a man like Rob Reiner finally breaks free, the monster loses its power. And according to this narrative, the monster could not allow that. When the news finally broke, Hollywood didn't react the way it usually does. There were no clever captions, no glossy tributes timed for maximum engagement, no perfectly framed statements that sound like they came from a committee. The industry froze. And in the middle of that freeze, one detail cut through everything because it wasn't public at first. It was personal. Dick Van Dyke didn't sleep, not because he was chasing drama, not because he needed attention, but because this wasn't celebrity news to him. This was a family he'd known for decades, tangled into the fabric of his own life. He had just turned 100. One day earlier, it had been candles, smiles, celebration. The world marveling that a man could still carry that much light for that long. And then, the very next day, the light turned to shock, because Rob and Michelle Reiner weren't just names in a headline. They were friends, the kind of friends who leave messages, the kind of friends you expect to call back next week, next month, next year, and suddenly there's nothing to call back. In the days that followed, the reality hardened into something far more brutal than rumor. Prosecutors filed first-degree murder charges against their son, Nick Reiner, and the case moved from heartbreak into the cold machinery of the justice system. It wasn't a movie, it wasn't a script, It was a courtroom calendar. And the sharpest pain in stories like this is always the same. Not the press conference, not the legal wording. It's the ordinary human detail hiding behind it. A wife remembering how many birthday messages Michelle left. A husband remembering he spoke to Rob not long ago, close enough that the voice is still fresh in his mind. That's the kind of closeness that makes tragedy feel unreal, because your brain keeps insisting for a few seconds at a time that it must be a mistake. Then it hits again, and again, and again. For Dick, the grief didn't just land as loss, it landed as an unbearable kind of irony. Carl Reiner created a show that turned family chaos into laughter. He taught America how to survive life's messiness by finding the humor inside it. He built something warm and human, a world where home was a place you could fight, forgive, and still love each other at the end of the episode. And now, the story that carried that legacy forward ended in a way so cruel it didn't feel modern. It felt ancient. It felt like the oldest tragedy in the world. That's why the silence after it wasn't just mourning. It was shock. It was disbelief. It was the unbearable moment when you realize love can't always save people and time can't rewind the last few days, no matter how badly you want it. Even the people closest to the Reiners weren't rushing to turn this into a spectacle. Their surviving family asked for privacy. They spoke with gratitude for the support, but also with the kind of pain that makes every word feel heavy. And in that quiet, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't just the death of two people. It was the collapse of a household the world assumed was safe. A reminder that behind gates, behind fame, behind success, a family can still be fighting something the world never sees until it's too late. And that is where this story changes shape. Because from here, it's no longer only about what happened. It's about what people do after something like this happens. Who controls the narrative? Who gets painted as what? What gets remembered? What gets erased? And whether the world learns anything at all before another family somewhere else repeats the same mistake of thinking love alone is enough. At first, it was just a headline. Two people found inside a home in Brentwood, a legendary name attached to it, and that awful hollow feeling that this story was still loading, like your mind was refusing to let the words become real. But then the next layer arrived, not from a rumor, not from a whisper, from a podium, a press conference, bright lights, microphones, cameras, and the kind of official language that doesn't care about nostalgia or legacy or how many people you've made us smile. In that moment, the tragedy stopped being unthinkable. It became a case, 2 counts, a special circumstance, a weapon described with chilling simplicity, a knife, and suddenly everything that had felt distant snapped into focus. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something you could soften with time. This was the criminal justice system turning grief into paperwork. The accusations were blunt, and the stakes were even blunter. If convicted, the maximum punishment on the table was the harshest kind of ending a courtroom can deliver. Not poetic, not cinematic, just final. And even in the cold structure of a legal procedure, there was a sentence that sounded like a reminder to the entire world. These are allegations, and the defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty. That line matters because it forces you to sit in the most unbearable space of all, a space where a family can be gone, and the full truth is still locked behind investigation files, evidence bags, and a future date circled on a court calendar. reports say the next court date is set for early January. And what's haunting about that isn't just the wait. It's what the wait does to everyone left behind, because the public moves fast, we scroll, we react, we share, we argue in comment sections like strangers have the right to certainty. But the people living inside the wreckage don't get to move on. They wake up to the same silence. They walk past the same empty rooms. They hear the same voicemail notifications and realize those messages will never be answered. In the middle of all that, the Reiner family's surviving children did what grieving families always do when the world turns their private nightmare into a public event. They asked for compassion. They asked for privacy. And they said plainly that a memorial will come later. Because right now, they're not thinking about ceremonies. They're thinking about surviving the next morning. And that's where Dick Van Dyke's reaction becomes more than just sadness. Because this isn't a tragedy happening to strangers. This is happening to people who were woven into his life through decades of shared history. Through Carl Reiner, through old Hollywood friendships that were never meant to end like this. His wife described him staying awake through the night, chasing updates, refusing to sleep, because when something this cruel happens, your mind keeps trying to find a version of reality where it isn't true. But there isn't one. There's only the version where the phones stop ringing and the calendar keeps moving toward court dates. And now the story sits in a terrifying limbo. The world knows enough to be horrified, but not enough to feel closure. And that's what makes the next part so heavy. Because once the shock fades, something else starts to rise. Questions. Not just what happened, but how does a family carry this kind of wound? What happens to a legacy when the ending is stained by violence? And what does justice even look like when the people you loved are the ones who are gone? In the days after December 14th, something else happened besides grief. The internet did what it always does when a story is too painful, too confusing, too final. It started inventing versions that were easier to swallow. Some posts turned the tragedy into a political weapon. Some tried to force a clean motive onto something that may never feel clean. Some people chased conspiracies, as if a bigger reason would somehow make the loss less brutal. But here's the problem. When you rush to invent meaning, you end up erasing the only thing that actually matters, the human beings. Because what we know, based on what's been publicly reported, is already devastating enough. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were found dead inside their Brentwood home. Their son, Nick Reiner, was arrested and has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. And now the story is no longer in Hollywood's hands. It's in the hands of detectives, prosecutors, forensic teams, and court dates that don't care how beloved someone was. Early January is sitting there on the calendar like a second Udar, not because it brings comfort, because it brings procedure. And procedure is brutal because it forces the world to talk about people like evidence. A life becomes a timeline, a marriage becomes a scene, a family becomes a file. In this kind of tragedy, the public keeps asking the same question, like it's a key that unlocks peace. Why? But why is a dangerous word here, because sometimes the most honest answer is the one nobody wants to hear. There may not be a single clean reason that makes this feel understandable. There may only be a chain of pain, instability, fear, and moments that don't look like warning signs until you're staring at the ending. Reports have raised questions about mental health and prior struggles. And if that's part of the reality behind this case, it adds another layer of heartbreak, because then you're not just grieving death, you're grieving the possibility that somewhere along the line, a family was trying to survive something bigger than them and still lost. And that's why the Reiner's children didn't step forward with a spectacle. They released a statement asking for privacy and compassion, saying a memorial would come later. Later. That word tells you everything. It means we're not ready. It means we're still in shock. It means we're still waking up every morning and realizing again that this isn't a nightmare you can shake off. And then there's Dick Van Dyke. Not a headline chaser, not a drama addict, just an old man freshly turned 100, sitting with the kind of sorrow that makes sleep feel impossible. Because it wasn't just Rob Reiner, famous director. It was Rob, a name connected to decades of shared history, a link to Carl Reiner, a reminder of a Hollywood that felt smaller, warmer, more human. And when Dick's wife talked about him staying awake through the night, waiting for information, it didn't feel like celebrity commentary. It felt like what happens when someone you've known for years suddenly becomes a story you can't stop reading because you're begging to find a sentence that says it didn't happen. But there isn't one. Only silence, only messages on a phone that will never be returned. Only the terrible realization that legacy doesn't protect you from tragedy. And now the world is left with a choice. We can keep feeding the ugliest corners of this story, turning it into content, rage, conspiracy, and blame, or we can sit with the truth that this is what it is at its core. A family destroyed, 2 lives ended, and a future that will now be decided by a courtroom, not a film set. Because justice, whatever it becomes in this case, cannot do the one thing everyone secretly wants. It cannot rewind time. It cannot unring the phone. It cannot reopen the front door to a house that should still be filled with laughter. And that's what makes the next part so hard, because once the shock wears off, grief doesn't disappear. It changes shape. It turns into a question that haunts everyone left behind. How do you remember someone's life when the ending is too painful to say out loud? There's a moment after a tragedy like this when the shock finally loosens its grip and something quieter moves in. Memory. Not the kind that trends, not the kind that turns into a montage with sad music and perfect lighting. The real kind. The kind that hits you while you're doing something ordinary, like washing a glass, and suddenly you hear a line from a movie or you see a scene in your head and you realize the person who helped make that moment is gone. That's what made Rob Reiner's death feel so unreal to so many people, because Rob didn't just direct films, he directed the emotional language of millions of lives. He made stories about friendship that felt like childhood itself, about love that felt clumsy, honest, and painfully human, about justice that felt worth believing in, even when the world got darker. And that's why, in the days after December 14th, the tributes weren't only about a filmmaker, they were about the pieces of ourselves we leave inside the films that carried us. Because when you look at Rob's work, a pattern shows up. He was drawn to people who were trying to be decent in a messy world, kids trying to grow up too fast, friends trying to hold on to each other, adults trying to find love without losing themselves, men trying to do the right thing while the room around them is filled with pressure and compromise. That isn't just storytelling, that's a worldview. and then you remember something else that makes this tragedy even more unbearable. Rob wasn't born into a normal Hollywood story. He was born into legacy. His father, Carl Reiner, helped shape the era that made Dick Van Dyke a household name. That connection wasn't just professional history, it was family history. It was generations of laughter, working side by side, passing the torch without ever imagining the torch could end in this kind of darkness. So when Dick Van Dyke's wife spoke about him not sleeping after the news, it wasn't celebrity reaction. It sounded like an elder watching a family tree get struck by lightning. Because if you live long enough, you start to believe you've seen the worst life can do. And then life finds a way to surprise you. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable, but it matters. Rob Reiner's death is being discussed in the same breath as criminal charges against his son. That reality creates a kind of grief that has no clean shape. It's grief tangled with disbelief, love tangled with horror, a family name tangled with a courtroom. And in stories like this, people rush to choose sides emotionally because it's easier than sitting in complexity. But the surviving family didn't do that. They asked for compassion. They asked for privacy. They said a memorial will come later, which is another way of saying we can't do closure on the internet's schedule. We're still trying to breathe. And that's what makes the legacy question so heavy, because legacies are supposed to be clean, a career reel, a highlight package, a final image that feels complete. But real life doesn't honor that. Real life leaves you with the unbearable truth that someone can spend decades making the world feel warmer and still face a final chapter that feels ice cold. And yet, the work remains. Somewhere tonight, someone will rewatch Stand By Me and feel 12 years old again. Someone will quote The Princess Bride and laugh like they needed to be reminded that joy still exists. Someone will rewatch a courtroom scene and feel that old stubborn desire for truth. Rob is gone, but what he gave people, what he planted in culture, doesn't die on the same day. And that's what makes the next part even harder, because while the world revisits his best scenes, the legal process keeps moving forward. Calendar dates, courtrooms, evidence, and the question becomes, how does Hollywood remember a man while a case like this is still unfolding? And that's the cruelest part. The films still play. The quotes still make people smile. But the house is silent now, and somewhere on a courtroom calendar, a date waits for a truth that can't bring anyone back.